Welcome back to the True Crime Collection, where Jen and Brian are diving into the world's most chilling crimes. From unsolved mysteries to dark endeavors, they uncover the stories that will keep you hooked. This is the True Crime Collection.
All right, so are you ready to really dive into Jack the Ripper?
Oh, absolutely. I'm ready to go down that rabbit hole.
Buckle up, because we're not just going to rehash the same old suspects. We're talking about a deep dive into the heart of Victorian London, exploring not just the killings, but what makes this case stay with us, even over a century later.
Right. And the atmosphere of that time period plays a huge part.
It really does. Expert speaker, what is it about this case that you find so compelling, even after all this time?
You know, it's not just about unmasking who this Jack the Ripper was. It's this chilling look at how terror embeds itself in a society, how the anxieties of a particular time and place just get so intertwined with these horrific events. And of course, it's about the victims, these women. These women weren't just names on a police report. They were real people, just trying to survive in a city that was often brutally unforgiving.
Right. It's easy to forget that. These were real people with real lives. And that's where this deep dive takes us. We're going to follow the Ripper's path from those first whispers of fear in Whitechapel to the theories that people are still debating today. Be prepared for some unsettling details, but also for some insights into Victorian London, the newspapers, the media, and why some mysteries never die.
Yeah, it's like trying to piece together this puzzle where some of the pieces are just lost forever to time.
And we only have those little pieces to work with.
Exactly. And to really understand the impact of Jack the Ripper, we need to transport ourselves back to 1888. Picture the Whitechapel district in London. This wasn't the London you see on a postcard today.
Okay, paint us a picture. What was life in Whitechapel actually like for the people who lived there?
Imagine this narrow cobblestone streets that are winding through these decaying buildings, often completely shrouded in this thick, almost suffocating fog. Open sewers filling the air with a stench you can't even imagine. It was a stark contrast to the London that you think of, like the opulence of the West End. Worlds away, both geographically and in terms of economics.
And that notorious London fog, it's almost cliche now, but I imagine it added an entirely different level of fear to everything.
Oh, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That dense fog wasn't just atmosphere. It was like another character in this story. It cloaked everything in this damp and disorienting blanket. The nights were already dark, you can imagine. But the fog just amplified that darkness, making it the perfect cover for anyone who wanted to vanish.
Right, like they just disappeared into thin air.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the physical environment that was harsh. Whitechapel was plagued by poverty and social unrest. Many residents were just barely scraping by, struggling to find work, often turning to whatever offered a moment's escape.
Whether that was alcohol or, in some cases, something even more desperate.
Yes, and those are the women the Ripper targeted. They were known as unfortunates. Women forced onto the streets, vulnerable not only to a killer, but to a system that gave them very few choices.
It's easy to see how desperation could become a way of life in those circumstances, especially for these women.
It's heartbreaking when you read their stories.
Our sources talk about the lives of these women like Polly Mickles just trying to earn enough for a bed in a doss house, which is basically just a very, very basic, overcrowded lodging house.
And even then, she couldn't always afford it.
Right, and she was showing off this new bonnet she had just bought right before that night.
And tragically, she couldn't even afford that 4-pence charge for the doss house that night, meaning that she had to stay out on the streets. That choice, which was driven by poverty, ultimately made her an easy target.
Such a harsh reality check about what these women faced daily just to get by.
And then you have Annie Chapman,
who, after her husband died, turned to alcohol to numb the pain.
which led her down a very difficult path, as you can imagine.
Each of their stories is just this awful illustration of how precarious life was in Whitechapel.
And you know, it wasn't just their circumstances, but sometimes just their appearance made them targets. Take Elizabeth Stride, for example.
What was different about her?
Well, she was known as Long Liz because of her height.
So she stood out.
Exactly. It just makes you realize how terrifyingly random this killer selection could be.
So basically any of them could be a target, just going about their lives. That's a scary thought.
It is.
But even with the hardships they faced, some of the victims, like Catherine Eddowes, seemed to retain a spark of defiance.
Oh, absolutely.
She was known for her sharp wit and even joked with police officers not long before her murder.
It speaks volumes about the resilience of the human spirit, doesn't it? Even in the face of such terrible circumstances, these women found ways to cope, to find moments of humor, to cling to hope.
There's something really powerful about that.
And then there's Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the Ripper's victims.
So what do we know about her?
Well, according to our sources, she had dreams. She loved to sing and dreamed of a life beyond Whitechapel.
It's heartbreaking.
It makes the violence of her death all the more disturbing.
It really does. It makes you think about how much fear must have been in the air.
Absolutely.
As the Ripper's crimes continued.
People were terrified.
These women's lives all intersected with this killer who was stalking the streets of Whitechapel.
And their fear, while impossible for us to fully comprehend, is a palpable presence in this story.
It hangs over everything.
It does. It's important to remember that Whitechapel back then was a place where, whispers and rumors traveled fast, but actual, accurate information.
Right. It's like trying to grab a hold of smoke.
Exactly.
So how did the police even begin to approach a case like this, especially in a place like Whitechapel?
Imagine trying to chase a shadow in a maze and then cover that maze in fog. That's basically what the investigators were dealing with.
Oh, totally.
Whitechapel, with its winding streets and this close-knit community, was already a tough place to investigate anything. And then add to that the limitations of the time period.
Right. We're talking like pre-fingerprints, pre-DNA, basically none of the tools that we now just expect in criminal investigation.
Exactly. Their main tools were eyewitness accounts, which, as you can imagine, in the fog and the darkness, weren't always reliable.
Not at all.
It's no wonder the Ripper was never caught, at least not definitively.
It's incredible to think about.
It is. They were really trying everything they could, increasing patrols, chasing down every rumor. But the Ripper always seemed to be one step ahead, almost like he knew the streets better than they did.
Like he was always watching.
It's an unsettling thought.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And as the fear in Whitechapel intensified, the Ripper story took another turn, didn't it?
Yeah, he claimed his next victim.
Right.
But this time, the circumstances were very different.
You're talking about Mary Jane Kelly.
Yes.
What made her murder stand apart from the others?
This time, the Ripper didn't strike on those fog-choked streets. He entered Mary Jane Kelly's rented room.
He was inside her home.
It really changed the whole perception of safety at the time.
You're right, because it went from being this monster lurking in the shadows to something much more calculated,
Absolutely, and the brutality of the crime scene, it was like nothing they'd ever seen before.
And what was different?
Well, the sources detail a level of mutilation that surpasses even the previous attacks.
Oh, wow.
It was as if the Ripper was making a statement.
This is my masterpiece.
A terrifying crescendo to his reign of terror.
Chilling. And it's that escalation that makes you wonder about the why of it all. Was there something about the crimes themselves, the way they were carried out, that could shed light on the killer's motives?
Right. Was it just about the killing? Or was it something more?
Or his mental state?
Exactly. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
The Ripper's M.O., while considered gruesome by anyone's standards, did seem to follow a pattern, at least at first.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, the early murders, they involved these deep slash wounds to the throat and the abdomen.
Brutal, but arguably quick.
Right, what some might call efficient and consistent. But as the murders went on, the brutality escalated.
So that consistency went out the window.
It did. It was as if the killer was becoming bolder, more experimental, you could say.
Like he was honing a skill, but a terrifying and horrific one at that.
It's a disturbing thought.
It sends chills down my spine to even think about it.
I can imagine, and it's led some to theorize that this escalation wasn't random.
That's interesting.
Could it be a sign of the killer unraveling? Becoming less controlled, more impulsive with each attack?
Like he couldn't control those urges anymore?
Or was it something more calculated? A deliberate attempt to amplify the terror, to taunt the police.
To toy with them.
And further embed himself into the city psyche.
Wow, so many possibilities. Adding another layer to the puzzle of Jack the Ripper.
It really does.
Speaking of puzzles, let's talk suspects. We received a ton of research on this, and there are a lot of theories out there. But our sources today focus on 3 suspects in particular: Montague John Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, and Sir William Gull. Let's start with Druitt. What made him stand out to investigators?
Druitt was an interesting character. He was a barrister and a school teacher from a well-respected family.
So a respectable citizen.
On the surface, he lived a fairly typical life. But sources indicate that he struggled with what we would now recognize as severe depression.
Okay, so he had his own demons.
And the timing of his disappearance is what really piqued those investigators' interest.
Oh, I mean.
He vanished around the same time as Mary Jane Kelly's murder.
So we have a potential suspect with a history of mental health struggles who disappears right after the final and most brutal murder. I can see why investigators would hone in on that.
Absolutely.
But was there anything concrete actually tying him to the crimes?
See, that's the biggest hurdle with Druitt. While his disappearance and the timing of it were suspicious, there was no solid evidence linking him to any of the crime scenes.
So nothing concrete?
No, some of his personal belongings did go missing after his death, which fueled speculation, of course.
Yeah.
But without anything solid, he remained a person of interest. A possibility, but not a definitive answer.
A classic dead end, it seems, in the Jack the Ripper case.
It really is.
What about Aaron Kosminski? His name comes up a lot when you read about Jack the Ripper.
Kosminski is a much more controversial figure in the Ripper saga.
Okay, how so?
He was a Polish immigrant living in Whitechapel, and, according to some sources, suffered from severe mental illness.
So another with a history of mental illness.
Right at the time, there were whispers of a witness identification, but it was never considered reliable enough to actually bring him to trial.
Interesting.
And for years, he remained just another name on this long list of potential suspects. But then enters the era of DNA analysis.
Yeah.
And things get a little more complicated.
Right, there was something about a shawl and DNA evidence. What's the story there?
Yes. The shawl. It's a piece of evidence that's as intriguing as it is frustratingly inconclusive.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So in 2014, a genetic analysis was conducted on a shawl that was supposedly found at the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder.
Supposedly.
Right. And the results pointed to Kosminski.
So case closed, right? I mean, DNA evidence, that's pretty ironclad. At least that's what we see on all the crime shows.
Not quite. The shawl itself is the biggest question mark here.
How so?
There's no definitive proof that it was actually present at the crime scene.
Oh, wow.
And even if it was, there's always the issue of contamination, especially given how much time has passed.
Right, it could have been contaminated at any point.
Exactly, which throws those DNA results into question.
So it's a case of the science being only as good as the sample itself.
Precise.
Another dead end, it seems. So we've got a possible suspect with no hard evidence, and then DNA results that might not even be relevant. And then there's this Sir William Gull character. Our sources mention something about a royal conspiracy. Now, that's what I call intriguing.
Intriguing is one word for it. Downright outlandish is another.
Okay, I'll bite. What's the story?
Well, Gull was the Queen's physician. And this theory alleges that the Ripper murders were part of a massive cover-up.
A cover-up to protect...
To protect the royal family from scandal.
Okay, you can't just drop a royal scandal bombshell and not give us the details.
Right.
Sorry.
What kind of scandal are we talking about?
So the story goes that Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's own grandson, allegedly fathered a child with a woman in Whitechapel.
Oh, wow.
And the theory posits that the murders were orchestrated to silence everyone involved and prevent this scandal from reaching the public.
Talk about a plot twist.
Yeah.
So Sir William Gull was acting as some kind of royal hitman,
That's the gist of it.
silencing anyone who threatened the crown.
You got it.
But, like with many theories surrounding this case, there's very little evidence to support it.
So it's probably not true.
Most historians dismiss it as a fanciful tale, more fiction than fact.
Right.
But it goes to show the lengths that people will go to to try and make sense of the senseless.
Or to make it more interesting.
Right, even if it means weaving in royalty and intrigue.
It's certainly a more captivating narrative than a troubled individual or a man with a possible connection to a shawl.
Oh, absolutely.
But even with all these suspects and theories, we're no closer to understanding what drove Jack the Ripper to commit such horrific acts.
And that's what keeps people fascinated, isn't it?
The mystery of it all.
The need to understand the why behind the who.
It's human nature.
It's human nature to try and find meaning, even in the darkest of places.
Which might be the scariest part of all. It's like we're looking into this abyss trying to find something recognizable staring back at us. But with Jack the Ripper, the reflection is fractured, distorted. We may never truly understand the motivations, the madness that fueled those crimes.
It's the ultimate mystery, isn't it?
It really is. But there was a method, however, twisted to the Ripper's madness. Didn't our sources mention something called the From Hell letter? You can't talk about Jack the Ripper without mentioning that.
Absolutely not. The From Hell letter, if it was actually real, offers a really chilling glimpse into the mind of the killer.
How so?
So picture this. A letter arrives at the Central News Agency, scrawled in barely legible handwriting, signed simply Jack the Ripper.
Oh, wow.
It sends shockwaves through the investigation and the public imagination.
It must have been freaking out.
Oh, totally. This wasn't just a rumor anymore. This was the alleged killer reaching out, inserting himself directly into the story.
Like something straight out of a horror novel.
Totally.
But it gets even more disturbing, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't there something included with that letter?
Yeah, there was this small box.
Yeah.
And inside, investigators found what they believed to be a human kidney.
Oh my gosh, are you serious?
Supposedly taken from Catherine Eddowes.
No way.
It's crazy, right?
That's insane.
And to this day, they still debate whether this was a genuine organ or some kind of a hoax.
Just to mess with them.
Right. But either way, the impact was undeniable.
It would be.
This wasn't just about murder anymore. It was about a killer toying with the authorities, toying with the public, and further fueling that atmosphere of terror that had gripped Whitechapel.
Yeah, they must have been beside themselves with fear. And this is where I think the media's role in the Jack the Ripper case really comes into play. They became part of the story, almost complicit in amplifying the Ripper's legend.
That's an interesting point, and I think you're right. The press, much like today, they craved these sensational stories.
Of course, who doesn't love a good story?
Right, and the Jack the Ripper case was tailor-made for headlines.
Oh, absolutely. Front page news every day.
Every gruesome detail, every twist and turn in the investigation, it was splashed across the front pages.
It's almost like they were giving him what he wanted.
You could say they played directly into the Ripper's hand,
Yeah.
turning him into this macabre celebrity, a biggie man that went way beyond the fog-choked streets of Whitechapel and embedded himself firmly in the public consciousness.
It's like he became this mythical figure.
He really did.
And in a way, he's still there. Even now, over a century later, people are still so drawn to this case. We're talking books, movies, even guided tours of Whitechapel. It's like this morbid fascination with the Ripper story is just woven into the fabric of the place.
It's a phenomenon known as dark tourism. And the Jack the Ripper case is probably one of the most enduring examples.
Right. It's like people are obsessed with him.
They are. There's just something about unsolved crimes, especially ones that are shrouded in this historical significance and those gruesome details. It just captures the imagination.
It's like a puzzle you can never solve.
Exactly. Maybe it's the need to try and make sense of the senseless. Or maybe it's the thrill of confronting that darker side of human nature.
I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
Whatever the reason, the story of Jack the Ripper is definitely cemented in our collective memory.
I don't think it's going anywhere.
So after this deep dive, after exploring the fog, the fear, and the facts, what's your final takeaway?
You know, I think it's the profound impact of the unknown.
What do you mean?
Well, we can examine the evidence. We can meticulously dissect all the theories. But in the end, we're left with more questions than answers.
It's true. We still don't know for sure who he was.
Right? Who was Jack the Ripper? What drove him to commit these horrific acts? Those are questions that may never have definitive solution.
And that's terrifying.
And in a way, that's the enduring power of this case. It's a puzzle box of history. That just keeps challenging us to find meaning in the shadows.
And maybe that's the true legacy of Jack the Ripper. Not just the crimes themselves, but the mystery that remains, the questions that linger long after the fog has cleared.
It definitely makes you think.
It does. It's a story that refuses to be forgotten, a puzzle that continues to fascinate us and frighten us.
Even after all these years.
Even after all these years. Well said, expert speaker. It's been a fascinating, if unsettling, exploration, to say the least.
It really has.
Listeners, we want to hear from you. Which suspect do you find the most compelling? Do you think we'll ever truly uncover the mystery of Jack the Ripper? Head over to our website and let us know your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop diving deeper into the mysteries that surround us.